cross-reference some of the work that you need to build
Yes.
across in some of the other units. So unit 1 and 3 tend to be, the ones which are quite extensive in terms of creation of evidence.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so let's start. Learning outcome 2 today. And obviously it says be able to apply theories, principles, and models of learning, communication, assessment to planning, inclusive teaching and learning. So this bit that we have learned in terms of, the inclusive teaching and learning is a concept that will get applied across to even your unit, which is the teaching in a specialist area. And to a certain extent, when you look at doing the unit 39, which is about behaviors. So in this unit, if I have to put across very, very briefly, in terms of how we will do this particular part of the task and cover the assessment criteria, here, first and foremost, what we need to do is we need to have some initial diagnostics at hand that we will be able to showcase as an evidence in the appendix. So why are they used is what we will cover here, but it says clearly, why is what you and me need to discuss to understand why is it that we use initial assessments or diagnostics. But the assessment criteria is going to say use them to agree with learners on some sort of SMART goals that you put. The second one is device as schema work. So there's a template that we have, and obviously for the area that you're teaching in, which is the SEM and or PHSSC, which you mentioned,
Mm-hmm.
what you need to be able to do is essentially use one of your sessions or units schema work, and that would essentially be it as a proof which will be attached as evidence in the appendix. Now here, when you draw up that schema work, what you're looking at doing is basically highlighting how the schema work is meeting the needs of the learners, how is it meeting the delivery of the curriculum, and what are the internal and external requirements. So internal requirements would be requirements within the school, within the setup. External will be legislation, requirements from Ofsted or some of the other regulatory bodies. That is what you would need to put down as verbatim to substantiate on the evidence that you have. The next one is design teaching and learning plans, which take into account. This is where the ILP comes in. The ILP which I had shown, one was the long reference ILP which I had shown, which was the Department of Further Education, Advanced Learner Loan, and the ILP which is for funded courses, wherein the government gives us, loans to learners. And there was a shorter version of the ILP which primarily had shared 2 pages, and that ILP you will need to have it as filled up to show how individual goals, needs, and learning preferences of learners are, put into that, agreed with the learners, and how do you put activities down which will allow learners to essentially, cover up the areas in which they are lacking. So, for example, if some learners submit, in my case, what tends to happen is some learners, if they tend to submit assignments, and these assignments are, let's say, shy of references, at least 6, then we normally give them a additional activity to develop Harvard referencing or the referencing techniques. Now, if learners on our side end up writing assignments or assessments which are in the first language, term, which is I, and what we want them to do is start writing into third person language, which is where the academic writing comes in, and they are able to reference, build arguments. So that is where the other set of activity is what we put in, and how it meets the requirement of the curriculum. Because when we look at learners completing certain tasks or activities in order to achieve a unit or a lesson, then in those cases, those are criteria which are laid down by external bodies, or they are a part of your curriculum plan, overall plan, in which what you as a teacher, tutor, lecturer is required to make sure that you are able to cover this, and learners are able to follow that. The next one is identify opportunities for learners. Again, here, some part of it is to do with inclusive teaching and learning. Some part of it is to do with how do you provide feedback to learners. So feedback can be in different formats, formative and summative, but there could also be feedback which is normally given across to different channels in terms of email, face-to-face feedback, verbal feedback, and that allows you to also collect feedback from your learners, and that is what we will discuss. And the last assessment criteria is explain how your own practice is basically including some of the things to make it inclusive. For example, understanding of the culture, understanding of the requirement and needs of your learners, their background, their prior qualifications, experience, skill set, and how do you then relate it to by using some of the theoretical models. So how do you underpin, for example, looking at some of the theories that we do talk about? If I shift you into the presentation, they would be the ones that you would need to refer to in order to, highlight that, okay, I use this theoretical framework, and that is where it relates to for me to understand how the learner's requirements are, or what the learner's requirement are. I put together these resources in terms of making sure that the learner is able to cope with that particular load or these sessions that you're planning, and you're able to take everyone along in the class to be able to achieve the goals and objectives. So these bits of theories that we've studied, there are a total of 11. If you go across some of the units, that unit 3 and unit 1, there will be 11 in total, to the best of my knowledge, if I recall. And these are the ones that you end up essentially referring to at some point in time. Some of them are management and teamwork related theories, but generally the theories that we have learned, which are in the pedagogical approach, work which has been carried out over the decades, wherein it's been done to understand and how to say, for example, these are around the areas of developing inclusive learning environment, looking at policies and integration in terms of equality and diversity. How do you make your teaching interactive and obviously more engaging? And in some cases, when we look at the theories related to learners' capability, their caliber, and obviously their ability to be able to understand and take things on when you do this. And then you have the clubs cycle, experiential club. You have the Bloom's taxonomy, and these are very known and very well accepted models. So there are some handouts that are provided in Unit 3, and they are all the theories that sometimes you will need to refer to in all the learning outcomes that we will study in pretty much this particular unit. And because it's all about application, so that is where if I pick out, say, why do we do initial assessments? Initial assessments are required because we are looking at structuring objectives and assessments basis the learner's requirements. So you have some part of Bloom's taxonomy being implemented into initial assessments and diagnostics that we do. Similarly, if we go into schema work and designing the schema work, collecting and collating resources, developing different activities that are going to be carried out when you deliver those sessions or lessons for a particular unit or subject area, then in those cases, you're looking at Vygotsky's and Piaget's zone and proximal development theory, because here you're looking at tailoring your activities to enable learners to be able to learn, not just by obviously making sure that they are learning, but you're also pushing them in terms of their cognitive abilities to be able to learn and progress in the class. And then there are bits and pieces which we understand wherein we use IT resources, different form of resources, but generally we would sometimes also refer to IT and IT related resources which could be used to augment teaching and delivery for certain learners or certain types of learners wherein they have disabilities or special requirements. So those bits are the bits that you need to cover in this particular learning outcome too. And what we have to do is whatever we are looking at covering, we are essentially looking at referencing it with some sort of evidence which basically says that, okay, this is what I do in my sessions or in my teaching as an approach, as a methodology. I follow this methodology. This is my approach to teaching and doing the sessions in the class. And I have an evidence of it. And what you do is describe that evidence by underpinning one of the theoretical models which is related or which could be related to the concept or assessment criteria that we are discussing. Is that okay?
Yep. Sorry, I'm just writing it down.
What I did at the start of the presentation, for learning outcome 2 is I have looked at my own areas. I've always done in the, in the entire presentations that I have redeveloped, wherein I've looked at higher education as the sector in which I have looked at specifically a particular subject area, which is strategic management. And within that, it encompasses HRM, leadership, and management as a subject or area or a discipline. And within that, some examples have been taken. Now, these are the theories that we are going to apply as far as the learning outcome 2 is concerned and its assessment criteria. So we're looking at application of theories, principles, and models. And these are the ones that I see 2.1, 2.2, 2.3, 2.4, 2.5, and they tend to apply across, the 5 assessment criteria that we have. So tabled it down, I filtered it down rather than just having it, quite generic. I filtered it down so that when you know that we are covering this assessment criteria, this is the theory that you need to relate to or underpin,
Yeah, no, that's really helpful.
right?
Yeah,
Now,
that's really helpful.
bits and pieces of examples, and just
Sorry,
to,
can I
yeah,
just, sorry, Raman,
yeah, go on.
to interrupt. So when I'm doing it, do you think it'd be useful to maybe have that table like you've got, and then maybe then go through each one and kind of explain how I use that within my sessions?
That's correct, yes. And that would be the evidence that you're showcasing, because this is how you're doing it. And then at the end of the day, when you have a teaching observation for this particular unit, that confirms that what you're following in the classroom in terms of your teaching and delivery is conforming to the curriculum, because somebody who's doing the teaching observation is confirming those judgments. And what you're also, it is not evaluated, but what at some stage would also come out quite clearly is that, okay, these are methodologies or approaches that you're taking, which are obviously leading to learners, achieving achieving in high numbers in the class, the goals and objectives which have been set. Now, I've done some very brief, recap of some of the theories in terms of words, just to make sure that, we know what we are talking about and how do they relate to some of the assessment criteria that you're going to do. And they are basically just bits and pieces. So I think one of the ones that we haven't covered earlier is Tuckman's theory. So when we look at team building in
Can I,
particular,
can I just ask, because I
yeah,
think I covered that with when I did my level 3 apprenticeship. Is Tuckman the one where he has the
5
storming?
stages.
Is he the storming,
Yeah,
forming?
norming,
Yeah,
storming, forming,
storming,
adjourning.
performing.
That's correct. Yeah, yeah. So this particular approach you tend to do when you try and do role plays and, activities which involve a group of learners within the class, and they are expected to present or, complete an activity as a group. And that is where this particular model of Tuckman's, theory comes in, which is basically related to the fact that you have to put them into a group. And sometimes when you see and you club students together or children together, what typically tends to happen is they don't tend to agree with each other, but obviously over a point in time, it goes through a process wherein the group will get into a forming stage. At some stage, they will fight, they will, have their differences, opinions. Then they get into norming, which means they become normal and understand, okay, this is what I will do, or this is what I can do. Then they start performing as a group. And then at some stage, what will happen is that once the activity is done, they go back to their individual, areas or individual type of present, in the activity. What we generally tend to see is what contribution each of them has made while doing
Yeah.
that activity. And that is where when these
It's
activities,
only because when I did as I said, I did the role play on Tuesday with them, and that sounds very much kind of what happened. And then kind of then at the end, I kind of got them all back together, and I said, what did you learn from this? And what are the consequences of smoking, alcohol, or drug consumption? So that kind of, I think, would cover that particular theory there.
that's correct. And what tends to happen is after that, they go back into their own, silos and obviously start working individually, which is where we need to fill in the observation record sheets to say, okay, as in the group activity or in this particular, role play or the group that they have got into, each of the members played this particular role, and that is where we see that they are hitting or, hitting a particular criteria or meeting the particular criteria, or assessment criteria, and that is where individual contributions that get documented. Now, if I look at practically now going to some of the assessment criteria, here what we are looking at is, for example, why do we need to do diagnostics? So one of the things that you normally come across, specifically in relation to, I would say, how do we look at finding out whether the children or the learners that we have, need certain additional, say for example, resources or additional support. So in terms of, if we end up asking the question that why do we, so why do we say, for example, need diagnostics in general as a, as a question, rather than adding the word test to it. What I would do is basically understand that why is it that we need to test this first. Sometimes what tends to happen is that if we do find that the learner is not engaging with us in the class, we sometimes tend to find that there could be some sort of an issue or a problem which is there. And in order to find out that issue or find out that problem, what you need to do is obviously start digging, find out what is it that is troubling the student or the child. And in some cases, then when you start investigating and going into details, what you then tend to find out is that, okay, that is the reason why this particular behavior is being shown, or this particular attitude is coming out. And what you then do is, as a teacher, try and resolve that in terms of finding out what are the additional resources, help, support, guidance that we can give, which will allow us to basically mitigate that disadvantage with the learner. And that is where what we tend to see is that diagnostic assessments or diagnostic tests are tend to be done. If I look at just a digression or an example, when you look at medicine, for example, why do we look at diagnostics or blood test or urine test or anything like that? Is because we find that there's something wrong with the body. And the first thing the doctor orders is, okay, can you get these bloods done, or can you get these tests done? And those tests then give you the results that, okay, there is something right or there is something wrong happening. And then they start to look at further investigations to uncover how this can be brought to, some sort of brought under control, or, help the patient overcome it. But when we look at relating it to teaching, what we are looking at with the diagnostics is trying to find out what are the unique, strengths, what are the needs, what are the weakness areas, what are the learning preferences, and how do we look at setting goals for the learners in the class so that they're able to essentially, learn or, go through the topic list that you have got, or the session that you're planning, and they are ending up achieving that particular goal and objective. So in such cases, what we do is generally what you'll see is you'll have what is called the diagnostic tests available. One of the most important tests that we end up using, is functional skills diagnostic test, which could be from BKSP or lots of different, bodies which provide different kind of tests depending on, in which area and in which field you're looking at doing it. So generally speaking, in our case, what we tend to look at is we look at diagnostic tests or initial assessment tests, which we normally carry out, and they are subject specific in our area. And what we tend to do is, if we do find that there are learners who are struggling, if we do find that the learners, essentially are not able to cope with something that we are looking at teaching in the class, then what we tend to do is use diagnostics to be able to, come to our rescue, basically determine if there are issues or uncover problems, and then we look at how do we resolve it. So this is an example of initial assessment that we do directly related to your assessment criteria, because it talks about use initial and diagnostics assessments to agreed learners' individual goals and learning preferences. One of them is this that you normally end up doing. The second that we are aware of is a VARC style questionnaire, that is to understand the learning styles, of learners, and how do they learn in general, whether they are visual learners, auditory learners, whether they are learning through body gestures or, kinesthetics. And that is where we would look at running these primarily as tests to understand, the requirements of our learners. So these diagnostics tests can be done to understand learning styles. They can be used to understand and look at testing prior knowledge, and also in some cases skills and abilities which are required to study, for example, a particular qualification or do a course. Now, if we look at apprenticeships, one such simple thing in that case would happen is that if the learners, if anybody is looking at joining an apprenticeship for a particular course, the test center or the college or the institution will essentially end up doing some diagnostics to see how good you are with IT literacy, how good you are with, say, for example, certain aspects of the course that you're joining, and do you have basic idea of or basic knowledge essentially of, getting to be able to start studying that course. We also look at academic preference in terms of academic, qualifications. So if you're trying to do a level 3 course or a level 4 course, what we then tend to do is look at the option of whether you have prior qualifications which help you show that you're progressing on toward the next level, and do your prior qualifications give you enough knowledge and skills to be able to study this high level of course. So different forms of diagnostics and diagnostics tests can be actually done, to essentially understand how we get to understanding our learners. And this could be primarily from a point of view of looking at understanding their needs, their strength areas, their weaknesses. It could be to look at learning preferences. It could also be to understand what are the reasons why would we would need to put some activities down in order to ensure that they are learning and they are moving along in the cycle of obviously teaching and learning that you do. Now, in the slides, what I've done is I've taken an example of initial assessments, which is required to be done when we have learners with special educational needs and disabilities. And in such cases, such assessments are useful because they will help us understand what additional resources would be required to be able to help the learner cope with the workload, or obviously cope with the the other parts, in general, cope with these sessions which are being done in the class. And we want to make sure that they don't fall behind and they have enough resources, material, guidance, support available to be able to study that comfortably. So, taken an example of a child who has undergone diagnostics assessment and has been we found that the child has dyslexia. And in such cases, the initial assessment for Mia, for example, I've taken a hypothetical example here. She undergoes a lot of initial assessments which are conducted by the special educational needs coordinator in the school, and that coordinator, along with the psychologist, the teacher or the form tutor essentially, and the special education tutor then, or a teacher, then come to some sort of a conclusion that after putting the child Mia through some of these diagnostic tests, they come to some sort of a conclusion to say, okay, once the diagnostics are done, these are the bits that we would need. These are the additional support requirements, and these are the ways in which we will mitigate some of the drawbacks or disabilities which the learner might have or the child might have. And these tests could be observational assessments. There could be standardized tests that sometimes you put the learners through. And in some cases, there would be interviews with parents and previous education partners who have helped in delivery of the education or qualification to that learner. Now, in the case of dyslexia, we look at phonological testing. We look at obviously reading fluency test. We look at writing and spelling assessments, and they would give us a very clear idea in terms of what is Mia's ability and what is the the severity of the disability that she has, and according to which we'll be able to put on the additional resources and support that she needs to cope with these sessions in the class. Then at some stage, we'll agree on these goals. These goals will also be agreed on with the parents or the carers to a certain extent. Some of these are short-term and long-term goals, and these would be predominantly helping the learner go through the curriculum, go through the topic list, and then achieve, along with some of the other learners or students or children who are studying in the same batch or the same session or in the same cohort. And then here, the idea at the end of it, of all the diagnostics, is to understand what are the learning preferences and what could be the requirements that the learner will have, which or child will have, which we need to substantiate in order to ensure that they are able to have a fuller experience or a richer experience of, or a no compromise experience of learning within the same environment. So this bit here is where I would suggest that you need to look at taking up an example. You will need to have some sort of an initial diagnostic assessment. We have it for various subjects, like business, accounting, law, healthcare, management. At lower levels, we have it for English and maths, and even for IT literacy. And they allow us to, conduct these tests. We have questionnaires mostly, and these then allow us to conduct and understand what are the needs and requirements of the learner, what level at which they have this disability. Is it severe? Is it so? Looking at a 3-point index of it is the risk is low, the risk is medium, or the risk is high. We then look at additional resources and support that could be provided through tutorials, would be provided through one-on-one discussions, providing the material in some sort of printed format. And then obviously, depending on if they have, say, a particular form of disability, then in those cases, we end up also taking some specialist advice to be able to understand how do we deal or how do we provide for these resources and budget for these resources. In some cases, even go back and fall back onto the council, wherein the council and some of the authorities would support, in funding that particular side of things or activities which the learner needs to do.
The only trouble is, so I think obviously there are students with dyslexia as well as lots of other learning needs within my school. So autism, like the whole range we've got basically at the school. But the only problem is with that, they've obviously, and we're obviously in the secondary, so a lot of that kind of diagnostic in terms of like being diagnosed with autism or global development delay or even something as dyslexia, all of that kind of has already been diagnosed and sort of implemented already. So obviously now then when they come to the secondary school, those like that sort of support is put in place. So for children with dyslexia, we've got a higher level teaching assistant. She actually does work with the dyslexic students. So in terms of actually doing the assessment, it's kind of already been done. So I'm not sure how I'm gonna kind of get around that kind of part of the like criteria.
So in your case, what you would need to do is basically get hold of some sort of diagnostics assessments, which are, normally through which the children are put through. Have at least something at hand which will allow you to, add it as an evidence to say, okay, these are the diagnostic assessments which are run within the organization. And obviously, in such cases, this is the path or the route that we end up taking, for the purposes of conducting these diagnostic assessments. And once you have, obviously got that with you, then you can, if you don't have the filled versions of it or the actual versions in terms of, maybe getting hold of, say, for example, a learner's, let's say something which is being done primarily as in practice, then in those cases, what I would suggest is you would need to describe it by attaching it as an evidence in the appendix to say, okay, in this case, what I would suggest is that this is how we go about doing the diagnostics, and once the results of the diagnostics are shared, these are the bits that we use or resources or things that we use for carrying out the initial diagnostics. Once they are carried out, these are the results which are there, and then that is how we put resources or additional, let's say, things in place for the child or for the learner to be able to, do teaching and basically do learning in the normal environment with us, as would be done by any other student.
So I've got a thought. So as you know, I work with the slightly older students, so sort of 16 to 18. So I'm just thinking of actually a particular student now in mind. So he's actually got dyslexia. And the colleague of mine that does like actual specific dyslexia intervention, I was just thinking, was there any way that I could maybe get hold of his assessment, then I could use that potentially as evidence. Is that correct?
Yes, that's correct. Yes. It will, there are two ways of looking at it. When you do your assignments, you can do them descriptively. And the other way would be to basically rather, do it in a way wherein you are practically doing them by attaching an evidence and then explaining that evidence briefly in terms of why it is important, how is it used, or, how it is put into place for the purposes of, let's say, carrying out the assessments. So typically in this qualification, what I would suggest is the more practical evidence that you have or more examples that you have, you might write maybe a page or so and show a form of initial assessment that would show your theoretical understanding. But if you show it in practice in the sense that this is how it is done and this is how it is delivered, I think that will be more useful.
I just think that would be a better way of doing it. So I actually get on quite well with his mum. So if we didn't actually have a copy of that, would it be, because I'd actually
anonymize some part of these, and
sorry,
you'll have to anonymize some part of this.
Yeah, no, of course,
Then put it across as evidence as an action and explain it briefly.
But if if we didn't have an example of that assessment, it would be good maybe to see if I could get a copy of that assessment, or
Yes.
even have a chat with her on the phone or something, just so I know kind of what kind of process that they followed to get him diagnosed with that. Would that make sense?
Yes.
Or am I trying to read too much into it?
No. Just go as per what the task is asking you to do, and I think that would be good enough in terms of, the main bit that you have to look at is how do you balance putting this across as evidence, and how do you add some sort of a practical evidence to show and then cross-reference it by explaining this is how it is implemented, or this is how it is carried out within the organization at your end. And
Okay.
that would be it.
Okay.
Okay. Now, in terms of the second one that we are looking at here, we are looking at drawing up a scheme of work. And that scheme of work that you have, or you might have a standard template. And what you would need to do is basically in that template itself, when you attach it as evidence, what you need to be able to do is clearly mark or highlight. Say, for example, if I attach a scheme of work, what I need to then do is look at talking about how does it meet the needs of learners. So you might have to explain that, okay, this is an activity, this is my lesson plan that I'm doing on such and such day, this is the activity involved, these are the resources, and that is how it meets the need of the learner. When you look at the delivery model and the internal and external requirements would be how that activity that you're carrying out, or what in particular, say, for example, a delivery that you're doing, how is it meeting the requirements of ensuring that this is the indicative content coverage, this is the learning outcome that I've covered, or this is what has helped me cover, this activity has helped me cover this particular learning outcome or assessment criteria in the unit. And that would be something that you relate to when it comes to this bit of talking about devising a scheme of work, taking into account and showing. So you might take a scheme of work, and in that you might handwrite it and cross-reference to say, okay, this is where it meets the need of learner, this particular activity, this particular model that I've used in terms of delivery. And that could be, say, you've used a presentation, you've used, say, for example, let's say in my case, if I look at a table that I've drawn up in terms of the schema work, this is how a schema work for strategic leadership looks like. Say across 10 weeks, I need to cover, all these topics which are as a part of that particular unit. So what I do is I group them into learning activities and some of the assessment tasks that I need to hit. And then what are the activities or assessments tasks that I will carry out, which will help me deliver the session. So in some cases, when I talk about approaches to leadership, I will probably look at doing a formative quiz, and approaching to leadership will cover some of the leadership styles like laissez-faire, autocratic, democratic. And what I would do is give them examples, but at the end of it, I will use a quiz to check their knowledge and check whether they've understood that particular topic in the session or not. So that would be a delivery model in the sense that when I teach approaches to leadership, I'm actually looking at picking up a particular area in terms of how I'm going to teach and deliver the topic, the indicative content, and that would constitute my delivery model on that day. Now, that could mean I'm doing a PowerPoint presentation followed by a bit of a role play or some group activity, and dividing the group into, number of learners into a group to say, okay, you discuss autocratic leadership, to discuss say, for example, democratic leadership, you discuss laissez-faire, and you discuss paternalistic leadership style. And then they will come up with brainstorming, some sort of discussions, and they will present that activity. And towards the end of it, once they all sit down, go back and take their seats, I will ask them a few questions. And those questions, if they answer well, would tell me and give me a feedback that, yes, this activity has helped them understand the concept and the various leadership approaches which could be applied, in different situations. So this particular assessment criteria that you start off, you're going to start off with essentially taking up a scheme of work. So if I look at a scheme of work, say, for example, we normally end up referencing it for a particular unit or say a particular topic. And that would essentially be quite a detailed document, 6, 7, 8, 10 pages document. Depends on how you want to put that across in terms of the task, because this is not a unit on schema work. This is primarily a task in which you need to showcase what is a schema work. But the showcasing of the schema work needs to be done to highlight three things. One, how does it meet the needs of the learners? what is the delivery model, and what are the internal and external requirements that you're taking into account to ensure that what you're delivering meets the criteria, meets the contents, helps you cover the theoretical models, and then gives them the knowledge and skills required to say, okay, yes, they've understood that topic. And that would be, I would say, a good part to begin with when I look at, say, for example, schema work. Now, I was looking at different forms of schema work, but it could come in any shape or form, predominantly depending on how you would have your own template from, or have something that you already have at your end, or maybe use one of the templates that we have provided. This is, for example, a schema work for mathematics. It's for Key Stage 2. There are so many details that it's year 3 and you have 34 children in the class, age 7 to 8. What are the various things that you need to cover? How do you break it up into different lessons? What are the various references, external references that you're referring to when you're doing the teaching and delivering as per this schema work? And what are the assessment strategies and any other special areas of consideration that you will have? You'll put them in other points or other areas of discussion. And this is a very, very simplistic form of schema work. You're breaking it down into learning outcomes. There are 6 of them. You'd probably do 6 sessions, but in those sessions, you're essentially looking at covering up the topics that you've given here in a very, very summarized form. This is
No,
one.
I think that's the one on Moodle, isn't it? Have you got that example on Moodle, Rahman?
Not. I don't think this is on Moodle. There is another one on Moodle which is slightly more detailed.
Okay.
Is
Are
an
you
MP
able to
shell.
upload that one? Because I quite like that. Like, because I think for me that's quite clear. So it kind of covers literally all those those 3 things that you've just spoken about: the needs, the model, and the external and internal. But that covers it on what, 2? Is that 2 sides of A4?
Yeah, that's absolutely fine. I can
And
get.
then that's predominantly, that's 2.2 covered, isn't it? Because that's everything you need within that particular outcome, isn't it?
That is correct. So that would be, I can upload that for you, and that
Yeah,
would,
that'd be
you
helpful.
can
Thank
modify
you.
it. No worries. So
Yeah,
that
no.
the second assessment criteria. The third one that we are looking at in particular is talking about how do you design your teaching and learning plans, which are going to take into account the individual goals and needs and learning preferences of learners. So here, what I would primarily do is, again, you'll have to dip back into what you're doing and how you're teaching. And what you need to cover in this is basically example of, I would say, in this case, how do you break? So we have done schema work in the previous assessment criteria. Here you would pick up one particular lesson plan from that schema work and show how you're actually teaching and delivering using things like inclusivity. You're looking at flexibility in terms of giving opportunities to the learners to be able to engage with you during some of those activities and sessions, and how the learners are essentially benefiting from that tailored experience that you're providing, because for each of your lessons that you're doing, you're actually carrying out some sort of different activities which will help the learner understand the topic and the help them cover the indicative content in that particular topic list. So here you might look at picking out one particular lesson that you would do, and within that lesson what you want to do is break it down into how you're actually going to teach and deliver that lesson, which will meet the needs of the learners. So in my case, for strategic management and leadership, what I tend to do is, if I'm going to do this across 10 weeks, I would break it up into, let's say, 10 sessions that I'm going to teach. And within those 10 sessions, I will have a very clear criteria in terms of how and what topic, what particular details I'm going to cover related to the unit. So if I have to look at showing how do I design teaching and learning plans for a particular unit or a course that I'm teaching and delivering, what I would do is follow that into a schema work. And then I say, for example, if I need to look at week 8 for leadership, I'm looking at covering ethics and values. And that would mean that I would need to do a broader discussion on what are ethics, why are ethics important at the management level, what are the values the leaders need to have, or the management people in management need to have who exhibit leadership qualities, and then look at what are the various activities that I'm going to use to explain that in the class, and then how would I get the assessment? How do I go across and obviously get an assessment in terms of judgment that this is what I've taught, this is what I've delivered, this is what the learners have understood. So if you take something in the later half, of your schema work, for example, if you have a 12-week schema work, or sometimes we have schema works would run into a semester. So a term, essentially, as we call it in the UK. So what will typically happen is, if you look at a term will be typically 12 weeks. And within those 12 weeks, you would probably have the latter part of the weeks focusing on some sort of assessments happening to what has been delivered in the initial part when you started the term. So there could be assessments which children go through. For example, in primary and secondary school, children typically, when they're nearing the half term or the end of that particular term, what they would typically have is there are some sort of assessments, tests, quizzes, or knowledge-based checking exercises, which happen typically in, I would say, secondary school. And in primary school, they tend to be activities which are documented on the notepads and books, which essentially would at some stage be seen as a full part of their achievement when it is tallied towards the end of the year. So what you will need to do is pick out a particular sweet spot wherein you're able to pick out a lesson plan, and within that lesson plan, pick out a particular activity that you can document and show how does it meet the teaching and learning plans or learning plans of the learners, essentially related to your area of specialism or your area of teaching. So a table here to show a snapshot of how you plan the schema work, and then which week you are taking in particular, which will be a single learning plan or an individual learning plan, individual lesson plan that will allow you to exhibit and showcase that how your teaching and learning is supporting the needs and the individual goals of the learners.
So
Is that?
could I also do that in like a template, something similar to what you've got up on the screen at the moment?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah. So let me just shift that over. Sorry, my mistake. Let me shift that over to the presentation. So this is where, sorry, I was showing that particular table of, when I started in terms of
Yeah,
the
no, that's fine.
assessment criteria. This is where you're looking at picking out one particular, week, and in that lesson plan, you're picking it up to explain what are the various activities that you would carry out and how would it meet the individual needs. Now, in this particular assessment criteria, if I put it this way, which is 2.3, what I would suggest you to look at would be, some sort of an individual learning plan or ILP. So if I individual learning plan, let me just quickly bring one out. Individual learning plan or ILP, and that is what will be related to the lesson plan to showcase that, okay, why do I have this activity on the on my planning for that particular lesson, is because what I see is that the learners have this particular need, and in order to fulfill that need in terms of they being able to understand, what I would need to do is carry out these activities to teach and deliver that lesson, and that would help in meeting the goals and objectives set in the individual learning plan. So it says design teaching and learning plans which will take into account individual goals, needs, or learning preferences of all learners and your curriculum requirements. So you might either take curriculum requirement as an example to attach in the appendix, or take the needs of the learners through an ILP like this, and then attach it by filling it up and attach it to the end by explaining how does it meet the needs of the learner. So for example, if I mentioned, as I did at the start of the session, that if I do find my learners, being weak on Harvard referencing, there would be an activity that I would put into how, in this plan. And that activity would be to say, you need to refine and, learn or pick up your referencing skills. So in those cases, what are the activities I'll put through? I'll say you need to go through a presentation of Harvard referencing. You need to practice by using site generator, how to do referencing or generate references, then go on to Microsoft Word and be able to use Harvard Anglia referencing system and start with citations, then go to, say, for example, quotes, And in the third part, look at paraphrasing, and they would then make the learner competent in terms of being able to, let's say, paraphrase and, use and include more references in their work. And that, because it's a goal which has been put in the individual learning plan that you need to improve your referencing, these activities that I've stated would essentially, if carried out in the class, would help the learner achieve that particular goal. And that is where you would need to be able to document this by using an ILP plan, and that would allow you to cover this assessment criteria.
So can I just ask, sorry, Raman, so we don't actually have, they've kind of done that away, they've done away with ILPs at my provision. So what they've got is they obviously have their education healthcare plan, and then obviously from that, and when that gets reviewed, that's obviously then like they have like goals and targets. So then could I kind of use that information and then obviously, so for one particular student, so then I could obviously use that information in terms of like goals and stuff. And then obviously the student, as I said, that I spoke about earlier with dyslexia, he's also in my group. So I could maybe pick out some of the things he needs to work on and then put that in the ILP template that you've just shown, and then just say how I take that into account when I kind of plan and deliver my sessions, obviously because he's in my group, as I said. Would that work?
Yeah, that works. Yes, that
Okay.
works, because in some cases, depending on where we are in HEFE or, in primary or secondary school, there could be different forms or formats through
Yeah,
which.
we don't use ILPs anymore.
So that's absolutely fine. I think in most schools and, in key stage 1, 2, and 3, what we normally look as the use of Pro Monitor and, some of these bits wherein it is not actually called an ILP, but basically a development plan, some sort of a plan which is put in place for students with, which have, say, for example, special needs. And in those cases, you would be using it to basically monitor and, track how this is helping the learner, go through the, let's say, the curriculum. Now, the other bit that I quickly look at with regards to, the assessment criteria 2.4. So if I put it this way, that if I just quickly go back onto the, unit spec for this. So if I look at 2.3, we are looking at some sort of a plan, ILP, individual plan, or some sort of a plan that you would need essentially that would allow you to carry this particular task off by adding, say, for example, an actual example, and that actual example would essentially be some sort of a developmental plan or plan that is used, in your case to, let's say, teach and deliver and design strategies, or, teach and deliver topics in a way which meets the individual requirement of the learners. Is that okay? So.
Yeah.
And then going to the next assessment criteria, wherein it talks about, looking at individual opportunities or opportunities in general that we can help provide to learners, and how do we look at developing inclusive practice. Here, what we are looking at is a couple of things. One, when we look at giving opportunities to learners, there are several methods through which you are going to be able to collect feedback, because this is related to your inclusive practice. So when we look at creating an environment which allows all types of learners from all walks of life, taking into account their cultural differences, diversity, their disabilities or their abilities, and obviously their academic, background, in some cases, even prior experience. When I look at higher education, what we are looking at is ensuring that as educators, as teachers, trainers, lecturers, we are able to understand how do we teach effectively or make our sessions so effective in terms of interactive, engaging, that it allows the learners, to feel that they are obviously not just learning, but they are also gaining in terms of, skills that are required for them to, achieve at the end of that, study of that particular qualification or that course. So there are different ways in which how we can collect this feedback. This feedback can be collected through things like student surveys, focus groups that are normally done. And it is not a case in point that all of these are done in all the institutions or all the setups, but generally you would see that depending on the setup and the the type of learners or the sector in which the learners and the institution is delivering to learners, they will choose one or two methods which are going to be a part and parcel of the overall process of looking at measuring and evaluating the process of teaching and learning in the organization. So in some cases, they tend to be, student surveys, focus groups. They could be, things wherein sometimes suggestions are required anonymously to be taken. For example, you'll find them during these suggestions to be taken during, for example, for facilities like canteen or, for example, areas or common areas in schools. And essentially, the management would want some sort of feedback on this, and they normally use the technique of or usage of suggestion box to be able to say, okay, these are the bits that we want suggestions on, and anybody can come in and anonymously drop something into it. And that would be then taken into context to understand why is it that this kind of a need is coming forward or, a demand is coming forward. You look at teaching observations or peer reviews, which tend to also sometimes happen, and they are also to help develop a supportive environment in terms of teaching and learning. So sometimes what we do see is that there are limited opportunities for learners to be able to give feedback. So if I look at going back to school, one of the things I can relate to is that you have these parent-teacher meetings or parent-teacher days in terms wherein you're required to go across and meet the teachers and obviously get feedback on your child. And in some cases, what tends to happen is that when this is happening, you also get an opportunity to ask questions and obviously give feedback in terms of some of the processes or policies which are being followed through in the school. For example, last couple of days, it was quite warm, and obviously the weather was lovely. And in most schools, the children were still required to wear jumpers and their coats. That was a bit uncomfortable for them. And I think out of the somebody in the school put out a suggestion. One of the parents, when they were on a usual trip to pick up and drop, I think one of the parents dropped a leaf, a suggestion in the box to say, for the next couple of days, as we know there is warm weather, the school should look at making the jumper optional, but obviously the jacket or the coat is mandatory. And that was taken on board. In the evening, you got an email from the school to the parents saying that, okay, for the next few days, because it's exceptionally going to be warm, 23, 24, we make it optional for the learners to, children to be able to wear those jumpers. And that's an example of how sometimes this feedback can be taken quite quickly to look at some sort of an inclusive practice, or showing that yes, we do take care, and we do take interest in obviously some of the suggestions which are put forward by parents. And that is where sometimes you see in school you have these parent governor boards or meetings which typically tend to happen, wherein they inform the school in terms of some of the bits from a parent's perspective, that these are working and these are not working. There could be other, lots of different types are there. So you have one-on-one meetings, you have parent guardian feedback. In certain cases for higher education institutions, you have the alumni in terms of people becoming a part of the alumni, network. And obviously parent governor meeting boards or parent governor boards are examples of advisory boards, which schools and councils in some cases encourage parents to participate on, and they tend to be one of the areas through which the school can identify opportunities by getting feedback from the children, and in this case, but from parents as well. So this would be required, sorry, to be covered in the assessment criteria 2.4. So essentially, any form of feedback which allows you to collect, a process through which it allows you to collect data. And that is something that you get evidence that it allows you to help create an inclusive learning environment in the classroom would be good enough. And that is what you would need to explain descriptively by taking any of that example to explain the evidence that you are attaching, and that would help you meet that criteria. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think I've got a few ideas.
And then look at the last one here. Obviously, it talks about your own practice and how do you look at making this, in my case, say, for example, I've only got you attending the sessions right now, but assuming if there were one or two other learners, then obviously that would allow me to ask more open-ended questions to make the sessions a bit more interactive so that there could be discussions which are happening between the learners. And then there are question and answer sessions happening between the learner and the tutor. And that would be an approach which will essentially show that it's a two-way process in the sense that learning is happening both ways, wherein some part of the learning I'm imparting, and that learning which you're picking up, or maybe the knowledge and the skills that you're picking up, is being discussed amongst colleagues or other learners on the course, and that is being discussed by taking into account how it is helping, or sometimes you're looking at the discussion on those ideas which will lead to a creation of a new idea or a new concept, or an approach which you would be able to use, hopefully, which will be useful going forward in terms of covering a particular let's say topic or content. So here, what you have to look at is you have to fall back on, because it talks about accounts of theories and principles and models of learning. What you'll have to do is fall back on one or two theories and look at picking out a relevant theory that you think you are able to bring and use that in teaching in the classroom when you do the actual teaching and learning in the class. And they could be models that you generally end up adopting and using when you plan your say lessons, and they become a part and parcel of how you teach and deliver in the classroom. And you fall back on those theories essentially because this is something that you're able to relate to, and you normally, depending on the style of your teaching, are able to then create an environment wherein it becomes an environment wherein the learners like to interact, they like to engage, they like to talk to each other, they feel more comfortable and confident in terms of asking questions or discussing ideas, and that bit tends to then essentially move forward the process of learning in the class. And these models, you don't need to apply all of them, but any one particular model that you feel you are comfortable with and that relates to your methodology in terms of our approach of teaching in the class is what you need to pick up and explain how that is related to the how that model essentially helps you in creating a more inclusive and more interactive and more engaging learning environment, or a classroom for a particular, say you might be even specific, taking into a particular lesson plan. So an example that I would give you here is sometimes when we have learners who come from the EU in particular or outside the EU, and they have come here to learn English. Now, one of the things that we do at some stages after you've done, say, 5 or 6 lessons in the term, what we do is we plan an educational tour. We take them across to the city center, take them across to the central library, or maybe some areas in which they are able to then put into practice what they are learning in terms of speaking, listening, reading, and writing. And they get to experience the culture, and that interactivity and going out and actually seeing it happen in action essentially tends to be more engaging and more learning for the learners, especially when they're learning a language. So you might have to think of an example that you do in your own setup, and that would be something that you bring across to showcase how your own practice that you do is looking into the area of being inclusive, is looking into the area of being interactive, engaging, and obviously related to the curriculum overall plan, and that is meeting the goals and objectives of the learners, also meeting the goals and objectives of the organization, and moving the learning forward for the learners. Is that okay?
Yep, sounds okay.
So that bit, is, I would say, 5 templates that you need to have. Maybe for the last one, it is mostly going to be a theoretical model that you'll quote, and then you'll explain it with an example in terms of how it relates to, your own area of teaching and learning, and how do you use that particular model or framework to, make the teaching and learning more inclusive and obviously more engaging. But the other 4 assessment criteria that we are looking at in this learning outcome are predominantly going to be using a template, putting it as an evidence, and then explaining that evidence by taking that particular example.
Sounds okay so far.
Good stuff. So what I'll do is I will upload the schema work which I'd shown you on Moodle just after this session, and the copy of this recording, if you need, I can hopefully send across to you maybe in an hour's time, because it takes about 15 minutes.
No, that's fine.
But it will be up on Moodle on Tuesday.
Yeah, no, that's great. So we're meeting again tomorrow, aren't we?
Tomorrow, yeah. We'll cover learning outcome 3 tomorrow.
Learning outcome 3, is it 3 and 4? I can't remember now. What have I got on here?
I think we need to cover. I think I'm kind of just lazied out yesterday, keeping in mind I was battling traffic and reached at
No. I honestly,
I just reached at 6:01 and I thought it's best.
How long does it take you to get back from the office to your home?
I think sometimes it takes about 20 minutes, sometimes it takes about 45 minutes, depending on how the traffic.
Yeah, you're the same as me. So I can get to work in 15 minutes, but then obviously depending on when I finish, it could take half an hour.
Sometimes, because it was miserable yesterday, it was pouring down, and I think
it was quite grim, wasn't it? So tomorrow it should have been learning outcome 4 and 5. So tomorrow we're hoping to do 3 and 4.
Well, we'll try and cover 3 tomorrow, and if you have the appetite, we'll cover some part of learning outcome 4 as well.
And then we're meeting Sunday again. So
how you take it, because I think in some of the learning outcomes, there are quite a few assessment criteria.
Okay. So yeah, and then we're going to meet hopefully tomorrow, Sunday, and
I think
Monday.
we've got one session which is tomorrow, which is 10 a.m. and
10,
then
yep. Sunday 10.
And then we've got Monday 10 a.m. as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's fine. No problem.
Okay, we'll see what we can get done, because obviously we missed yesterday as well. So
sure,
we want to catch up. All right. Well, thank you, Raman. I'll see you in the morning at 10 o'clock.
Okay. Take care.
Thanks, Raman. Bye-bye.
Bye.